All right, so the show has had this seminal first season. It comes back for a second year. You touched on kind of the next explosion that came from Steve Martin. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I leave just about at that point. And it was kind of interesting because Steve's association was with me. And he was sort of, not really, but I mean, he was a host that I kind of pushed in the door. And there was initial discomfort about the fact, he's the guy with the arrow in his head and stuff like that. And I remember going out on the road with Steve in the months before, starting in the spring of 75, and actually watching his act in places like Atlanta, and then sitting up and talking to him about how to shape various things up for Saturday Night Live and so on. And it really mattered to him to do it. And remember, he already had a fair amount of real fame at that point. I mean, he was one of the top stand-ups in the country, but more importantly, he had the many Tonight Shows and the Smothers Brothers and writing credits up the wazoo. But this really mattered to him a lot, and his manager really had fought for a long time to get this in, and I okayed it and then had to sell it into my friends. Now, I could obviously have flat out forced it, but I was never comfortable doing that. So the week came that he was to do the show, and some personal thing happened in my life, and it became the first show I ever missed. And they had a glorious time together, all of them. They just absolutely fell in love with him. And all of them, I've teased some of them to this day, conveniently forgot how he was not exactly the person they wanted the most. Now, to their eternal credit, they saw what I had seen. I'd been exposed to Steve. He's a wonderful man. And anyway, it was a great marriage they took. The only other one like that, which O'Donoghue and Lorne both came to their senses on. The fifth show ever, I want to say it's Robert Klein. The musical act is a group from Sweden called ABBA. And you would have thought that I had gone and shot their mothers. Oh my God, you're putting this pop act on, and because they wanted all the acts to be hip and over here or there. And I said, this is the biggest act in Europe, bar the Beatles. No one has ever sold these records. I lived in Europe for part of their time, the song contest they won, everything like that. You gotta have them play. And O'Donoghue, he was so mad. He said, well, I have an idea. We're not gonna present them like anybody else. He was so ticked that I had put what he considered a pop act on. He wrote this sketch around a ship sinking, and they're the band on the ship playing SOS while all hell is breaking loose. And remember how limited our facilities are. Davey Wilson has to find a way to tip the camera, and water's being poured from the balcony on the set and all that stuff. So I guess it's the day of the 25th, it's the night of the 25th anniversary show, and there's a segment that's going to be in that show about the music. And Lorne said, Dick, between the stuff you made us book in the beginning and all the stuff you had on in your years, that's more than half the music on this show, because most of that's the only stuff that's enduring at that point. Now that's 1999 or whatever. Since then they've gotten a little bit more pop in their taste and stuff, and I'm sure that won't happen again, but I felt that was kind of nice. They thought I was kind of a music whore, but ultimately that was the music that sustained.
Wow.
And Lorne was the person who was in London, I guess in '98 when Mamma Mia opened, and he saw it. I didn't see it again I didn't see it for another year. I think I've seen it 9 times now. But he said, "My God, I can't tell you how much fun it was. And you knew from the beginning, and we didn't." So anyway.
It's a great marriage of sensibilities, though, because I think from the beginning, Lorne Michaels was always kind of bridging that world of rock and roll and more progressive comedy, where relationships with people like Jagger or Paul Simon brought some of those great stars.
Well, we all met Paul at the same time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we did. When he was booked, and he and Lorne became instant friends.
But they didn't know each other prior to that.
Not at all. No. They became instant friends, and within I'd say no more than a year, Lorne bought the apartment next to his on the top floor on Central Park West, and their apartments connected through the area where the service elevator was. So if you went out of the back of Paul's apartment or the back out of Lorne's to put your garbage or your newspapers out or whatever, they connected. They were, and they are today. And I would say once every year or something like that. I have dinner with Lorne about 10 times a year, just the two of us off by ourselves in the state of the world. And at least once he invites Paul. And for Teddy's funeral, the 2004 Olympics, somebody, I can't remember if it was Paul himself or somebody close to Paul, it may have been somebody involved with him, sent me the song that Paul had recorded with Artie a long time before, but it never released, called Citizen of the Planet. And we used it in the Olympics in Athens twice. A beautiful song about sort of us all being together, being the citizen of the planet. And it had become a song that people in my family kind of fell for. Nobody came to that Olympics other than me in 2004. It just didn't make sense for anybody else to come. So they kind of fell in love with the song from afar. And when Teddy died, they started playing it a lot. I can't remember if it was my daughter or whatever said, you know, it'd really be great if Paul sang at the funeral. So he came and a cappella sang the song. And he said many times since to lots of people, it was the hardest thing he ever did in his life. He just told the story to Costas about a month ago. Because to get up at the end of that 2-hour funeral, which was about as sad as a funeral can get, and have to sing. But he's a remarkable guy, and those two guys are Lauren and Paul are absolute best friends. And I don't know any two people who are as loyal and supportive of each other as the two of them were. But that friendship came out of Saturday Night Live. Yeah.
All right, so talk about now.
You know, let me do one thing since we're talking
Sure.
about Lorne Michaels.
Sure.
In the spring of '80, the original show ends, and it ends very, very badly between Lorne and NBC. Not between Lorne and Brandon Tartikoff, but between Lorne and Fred Silverman, who was running NBC, because he felt he hadn't been respected. He felt that his desire to take a short break from the show, let his people produce it for a year while he kind of recouped. I mean, he had given his whole life to it for half a decade, and was totally responsible for its creative success. God, was he ever. And that was just sort of disdainfully swept aside. And not only didn't they pick him, they didn't pick any of his people to take over the show. They took his talent booker, a really good woman named Jean Dominion, but she had no comedy background at all. And so the show had too many odds against it, because when Lorne left, everybody loyal to Lorne left. So there were no writers who did both shows, the original and that next version of the show. No cast. It was really, really, really like a nuclear winter when you turned it on in mid-November. There was nothing there that was the same. And they really didn't have strong creative auspices, because they did have some good young writers, but they weren't quite ready yet. And so the show began to really spiral down and lost about half of the audience that it had been built up to over the previous 5 years. And so the inevitable, for the first time ever, is Saturday Night Live dead kind of headlines start to come up. And I think it's the very end of December that Brandon says to me, and we are best friends, both living in California by now. He's running programming at NBC, and I'm producing primetime variety specials and the Midnight Special, which is a weekly music show. So I'm pretty busy, and I'm liking my life. I've been fired by NBC, and I'll come back to that later, by Silverman in '79. But here we are in '81, and it's early January, and Brandon says, look, the only way the show's going to go on is if either you or Lorne go back, and I don't think there's any way he's going to go back. And we continue these conversations, and I'm still reluctant. And finally, in late February, I say, I'll come to New York if you can set it up in early March when you do a show, that I can watch the show from a office where nobody knows I am for a couple of days, because I'll be able to watch all the rehearsals. So I'll be able to see whether the material that's being written is any good in the first place, and then if it isn't, is the cast over the various rehearsals and dress rehearsal stuff, are they capable of making things better? I mean, so how far is the build back gonna be? Is there something I'm missing here or whatever? And so I do that on a Friday, I guess, and on a Saturday I watch the Air show in some office, I forget, secreted in this building, nobody knew I was here. And I meet with him late that night and tell him, you know, I'm willing to at least have a conversation. So I meet the next day with, I forget who, Brandon, and probably Erwin Siegelstein and somebody else to talk about how things would work. And I'm adamant that the show has to go off the air for 6 weeks minimum. I was probably nuts to say that, because I already knew I had to fire at least half the cast. I'd like to fire all of them just because I had to immediately turn the show around, and I had to find writers. And so the first argument was, well, we don't want the show to stop at all, and that's Fred's position. I said, well, then we don't have a conversation. I can't do that. The show's, I'm not going to put my name on this without having a shot at doing some stuff, and I've got to go out very quickly, look at some actors and or comedic talent, and I got to try to get a writing staff back. So we debate through the afternoon, and finally it's decided that we're in the ballpark of something. And I remember I gave them a really low number I wanted for salary, which kind of astounded them. And they said, why do you want to do that? And I said, well, for every year I keep the show alive, I want a series commitment. And that would ultimately lead me to things like Friday night videos, so I didn't have to do pilots, or the Costas talk show I did later, or later the association that I did with McMahon called Saturday Night's Main Event with Vince McMahon, which was wildly successful. And all very different sensibilities, obviously. One was a really hip talk show, the other was as populous as you could get. It was the first time wrestling was back on network television in 33 years, and on network television. And Friday Night Videos was pretty avant-garde. It was certainly the first time that videos had been seen by the mass audience, because MTV was so small at that point, it wasn't even on when the show launch wasn't on. MTV wasn't on in New York or LA. So I got that guarantee. I don't think any of them thought that they would ever have to, quote, pay off on it. They thought I was really taking on, other than Brandon, they thought I was really taking on a sinking ship. So we got all done, and they took me over to Silverman's apartment. We talked for a while. Fred said, I'm not happy that you're taking the show off the air. I said, Jesus, Fred, I'm only taking it off the air for 6 weeks. He says, no, 5. I said, okay, fine, 5 weeks. If a week makes, I'll take it off for 5 weeks. And I'll pick the repeats that air, because I got to warm up the time period again. And you have to find a right with the syndicator who now owns the rights to that show to get it for us. And they did. So like Pryor aired 1 week. I was just trying to warm up the time period because it was really bad. And they said, so are we all set? I said, well, one proviso. And they said, what's the proviso? You don't have a deal until I can persuade Lorne Michaels that this is something that he wants to see happen. And they said, what are you talking about? I said, unless Lorne actively wants this show to be his legacy, and I hope mine, then we should fold it up now, because the word has to go out to these writers. I can't train new writers to do the show. Maybe I can if I had it for 6 months, but I can't 6 weeks or 5 weeks. And they said, well, what does that mean? I said, I don't know. When I walk out of here, I'm going to call him, and if he's home, I'll go over and sit and talk to him. So I found him later that night, and I went over to his apartment on Central Park West, and I sat there with him until, I don't know, 6:30 or 7 o'clock the next morning, and convinced him, it wasn't hard once we got over some stuff, that he had nothing to lose. I mean, the show had already, in most people's mind, was Saturday Night Live dead. And I clearly could not put together a kind of team that had any shot at reviving it, unless he quietly, I said, I don't want you to do newspaper interviews, you just have to put the word out. So he agreed. I called somebody early in the morning. It was announced early that afternoon that the show was now mine. It was going off the air.
Was that a bitter pill for him to swallow?
For who?
For Lorne, to sort of bless.
No, God, no. No. It's an act of incredible generosity. No. There was no way he was going to do it. There was no way. He was mentally exhausted. He wanted a break from that whole world. He never seriously considered coming back. It wasn't a competition.
Mm-hmm.
He and I, whatever interesting...
No, but was he displeased enough with when you said everything that led up to his exodus?
No, because he thought, because it was me. It was me doing this. We were definitely close again. I mean, from 79 to early 81, we had spent a fair amount of time together. He had tried to persuade me to do a different show with him, which would have meant leaving California at that point, which I was in the midst of a marriage that was ending. I wasn't prepared to do that. So we had a really close thing. No, he was, by then, no, what I meant to say was everybody assumed the show was dead. And so reviving it, and with it being somebody who was part of the original group who was part of it, actually the person who kind of put it together, at least in terms of bringing all these people together who did it, and him putting the word out, because clearly it would be known by the people who mattered if the show succeeded, that he played a huge role just by the fact that he put the word out. No, he was wildly supportive to quite a degree, including the day before the first show actually is to air. He sends his then, I don't know if they were ever actually fiancé, but they would be married within about 4 months. He sent his Susan over to the studio, because that he wouldn't do. He would not. He just wasn't prepared to come into NBC at that particular juncture. Too much bitterness or whatever. Not about the show, but about NBC.
Right.
And not about Brandon Tartikoff. He never had anything but an adoration and love and respect for him. And she arrived, and they brought her upstairs to the office above the studio on the 9th floor. She came right in. She said, "Warren sent this over. He thought you'd need this tomorrow." And I opened up this box, and what was in the box was the duck pin that he had worn on his lapel for every Saturday Night Live he had ever produced. And you have to have been part of all this to know that sentimental gifts were not a big part of any of us at that point in our lives, and for him to do that was just unbelievable. So, in any case, that was how the show restarted. Now, let's back up.
Yeah.
I leave the original show after Halloween of 1976. Chevy and I actually leave together, and we fly to California together. He's leaving the show because his girlfriend, who is soon to become his wife, says it's over unless we're together. So he is signed to make a movie shortly thereafter with Goldie called Foul Play. So he's gone. And him leaving the show was a bitter pill. When we found out about it, Lauren and I, in the spring of 76, that it was going to happen. They all worked it out. Those two worked it out. But it was for a little while, a little bit perceived as a betrayal that, Chevy would leave us high and dry. But the bottom line is he had every right to, because he had never signed the performer contract. Somehow that had also.
I always wondered about that, because
he was the only one.
Networks usually insist on like 5 years of options.
By the way, you know how Belushi ended up being managed initially by Bernie Brillstein? It's the night of the first show. It's between Dress and Air, and there's some little lawyer following John around. He's the only member of the cast other than Chevy, who I think slipped through the rings because he had a signed writer's contract, but they were year to year. Anyway, John's contract wasn't signed, so it's now between Dress and Air. And I get John in the corner, and I said, "John, you can't do this. You can't put us in this position. You've got to sign this contract." And whatever propelled him to do it, I have no idea. He said, "Okay, I'll sign it if he'll manage me." And he pointed to Bernie, who was standing over there, who was at that point just Lauren's manager out of all of ours. And Bernie said, "Okay, I'll do it." So that's how John signed. Anyway, so I leave. I go to California. I'm in California no more than 24, 48 hours. And Rune calls and says he's just landed from Hawaii, where he's been in an ABC Board of Governors meeting, like their affiliate board, but the small key people. And that Elton Rule has approached him and formally offered him the job of running ABC News and continuing to have ABC Sports. And Rune wants to know if I'm in any position to come back and take on a role as his number two in these two things. And so I agree to meet him, and I take my wife. This is actually in the stupid Saturday Night. Is it in the Saturday Night Live movie? I can't remember. It's in one of the movies. But it's Rune and me in a hot tub, surrounded by babes, as opposed to, I often ask the writer and the screenwriter how that ever happened. They said, well, we determined at that point there were too many scenes in hotel rooms, so we turned it into the hotel hot tub. I went, oh, good. We're drinking martinis or Hawaiian drinks, which neither one of us drank. But in any case, we met in Rune's suite. I lived in a hotel with my wife, a house with my wife, about a half mile behind the Beverly Hills Hotel, and we got there at like 11 o'clock at night. And the two women fell asleep on the couches, I'm sure by 1, and Rune and I were still talking at 8 o'clock in the morning. But ultimately, I decided not to do it. And I quickly became, and it wasn't really articulated. NBC said I could go to California, but they didn't have a job for me. But quickly, within a space of about a month and a half, they created a job where I was the head of comedy, variety, and specials. And I would say within a couple of months at the almost 2 months, I hired Brandon, who was working at ABC as a current program executive. He's in charge of 2 shows. 8 is Enough, and God, the Kim Basinger show, Dog and Cat or something like that. And I hired him.
But a real low level, like current job at ABC.
Oh yeah. But he'd gone to Yale. He was a year behind me at Yale. He'd gone to Chicago and been the head of promotion for the ABC-owned station there, and made quite a reputation for himself. But was so eager to go to California, he jumped at the first job that was offered to him. And Silverman had just become the head of ABC, which was to be a very brief sojourn before he jumped to NBC. But Silverman. And so Brandon was out there, but he didn't have a contract. So when I hired him, he came to work for me, and he was my number 2 in comedy, I would say, from the summer of '77 until some point in July of '78.
Now, when you hired him, had you known him at Yale, or?
I had known him best after Yale. He knew me, but I had known him best after Yale because as soon as I started doing the Saturday Night Live thing, he was always sending me letters with comedy material, wanting to be hired. I had him come down to New York. We talked and stuff.
Hired in
like
what
that.
capacity?
As a writer. And I couldn't hire him as a writer. He wasn't a comedy writer. He thought he was, but he wasn't. He knows it. He even knows it now. But anyway, so now he's my number 2 in comedy. And he has that job for, I would guess, a little more than a year. And Silverman comes to NBC sometime in June of '78. Yeah. And he has a whirlwind week in Burbank. This is his first week in the job. And he assigns something like, I'll make this up, but I won't be far off, 12 or 14 variety shows and 20-odd comedy pilots, all of which he wants produced and ready to look at by the 15th of November.
Sounds like Fred.
And I go, Fred, that's not possible. For starters, none, I repeat, none of the good comedy producers are available because their new series start on the air in 2 months. Maybe if we're talking to them about getting ready to start writing those things in December, I can get them delivered in April. He says no. And I'm not disrespectful, but I just keep pointing out to him, we're just going to be pouring money down an empty drain because we're going to be forced to hire schlocks to write this stuff. Well, that begins this back and forth between the two of us, which I'm sure he took his insolence, and it wasn't on my part. So he comes up with this idea for a variety show called Pink Lady and Jeff, which is 2 Japanese pop singers who don't speak a word of English, and Jeff Altman, who was a serviceable, nice young comic, but not stand-up, but nothing that was going to work in prime time. And these people are now going to be like the modern-day Sonny and Cher. So I have to order the show. I order it. The first day it's in rehearsal with a script, I shut it down, which has always been my prerogative, and say, this doesn't work at all because neither of the 2 Japanese girls speak a single word of English.
Now, did you know that when you?
No, but I was quickly. I knew it by the time we got to the rehearsal stage. So their cue cards are written out phonetically. I mean, it's just a travesty. So I shut it down. And within about 2 seconds, all hell breaks loose. And actually, about an hour, the word goes from California back to the East Coast. Fred throws a temper tantrum, and I'm ordered to switch it all around. And there are a few things like that. Anyway, boom, the decision is made that Brandon, who's my number 2 in comedy, will become the head of the West Coast, and I will be working for him. And the way that they lay that out is to call him down to their offices. Fred's not there, but the other people tell him this. And he comes back up, and this is, without question, at this by the stage of my life, my best friend. And he says, you're going to hear something in a minute you don't like. I'm not allowed to tell you what it is, but just know I'll be outside in my car. So I go down and they tell me this, and they ask me what I think, and I said, I'm going to go think about this. So I go outside, we get in Brandon's car, and we drive away. And I would say this is before 10 o'clock in the morning, and they have no idea where we are for the next 6 hours. And they think they've now lost their 2. Whether Fred liked me or not, I was the executive, I was the youngest vice president in the history of NBC or RCA at that point. And that's still, that's 2 years, 2 and a half years after I'd gotten that youthful thing. I'm not yet 30. Or maybe I'm just 30. Anyway, and Brandon's the hotshot kid, but he hasn't done anything yet. And so we've gone off, and we have the most unbelievable, I mean, it's amusing and funny and sad. We're trying to decide whether we just bag it and go into business for ourselves, or whether we go back and he's willing to tell them he won't, this is him talking, he's willing to tell them he won't take the other job, he'll only stay if he works for me. And I'm going, no, 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 no. You've been totally loyal to me, and we're not going down that route. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back. I want you to tell them if they rip up my contract and they pay me, why. And B, Fred Silverman will sit in a room and talk to me for 20 minutes to explain to me how the hell he came to a set of circumstances like this, where first of all, he's putting us all through. By the way, among those other shows that were put in the hopper, Super Train, Hello Larry, I mean, it was the most insane time you've ever seen in your life. But I clearly wasn't ready to take dictation, and I'm not saying that Brandon was either, but that was what really set Fred off. So we go back, and Silverman has to have this meeting with me, which was wildly uncomfortable. And I realized inside of me, I guess by now it's like August, that this won't last for a very long period of time. But there's no way in the world that I want to embarrass Brandon. So this works out till about January, and I'm in New York, early January, and I come up for a meeting ostensibly with Silverman. And when I get to the floor, I'm told, hey, so-and-so wants to talk to you for a minute. So I go to so-and-so's office, which is in a different direction, because Fred was gutless. This guy fires me. So, and Brandon's not in New York, so I talked to him. He didn't know it, blah, blah, blah. So I go back to California. We join up one night. We talk again about whether we're both going to leave. And I keep telling him he's crazy. He's going to have a chance of a lifetime. You got to try to do this whole thing. And so I go into NBC for the rest of that week. And at the end of that week, they make me a ridiculous offer of like 3 months' pay against a 3-year hard contract. So they tell me that they'll provide an office for me. And so I come back. And
To do what?
well, they don't say. They'll provide an office for me as long as I want one, but I don't have a job. So I come back, I sit in my office for 2 days, and they tell me, no, you've got another office. And they walk me down to this other thing, and the office has no furniture, has a phone. So I decide, knowing what their offer is, I have nothing to lose. So I sit down on the floor, and I start making phone calls and all that. And people come in for meetings with the person who's going to succeed me working for Brandon in my area. The half of them don't want to meet. They come down by my office. All this. So this sets up a pretty impossible set of circumstances, but still nobody's bending. This goes on for about a week. And then finally Ronnie Howard, God bless his soul, who Deanne Barkley, who was the head of the film, TV, movie division of NBC, which was quite a big operation at that point. I think we had 2 movies for TV a week and all kinds of miniseries. She had made a deal with Ronnie to set him up as a director of TV movies and stuff, enough so that he quit, if you remember, Happy Days a year before everybody else did. And that was basically on that offer. And I was the comedy department. So he showed up for a meeting, and he went to where my office used to be. I wasn't there. They told him what the deal. He said, I'm not meeting with anybody. I'm meeting with Dick. He came down to my office, and I don't think it was 10 minutes before, I didn't know this at the time, but before the guy who had been the head of the West Coast before Brandon got the job, who was now there in an administrative role, was sent down to stick his head in the door and say, Dick, can I talk to you for a minute? And I walked to the door, and he said, we'll settle out your whole contract. So I left out one step. They did tell me when I went down to the office without chairs or a desk, that my assignment that they really wanted me to take was to go home and watch the competition and just provide a report once a week of what I thought of the shows on ABC and CBS. And I said, I don't think you want me to do this, because the one thing I'm going to make sure everybody in this town knows is you're paying me to watch the competition, but not you. So they had backed off of that. Now this was a wild, crazy NBC, and the only part of it that was familiar to me that I loved in terms of the management, because Herb was gone by this point, Silverman had replaced him, was Brandon, who was doing everything in his power to try to undo all this stuff. And plus we were still basically living together, at least on weekends, in my house in the hills and all that stuff like that, with Lily. So that set up my separation from NBC, and I went into Indie Prod from, I took 9 months off, and as Brandon once told the LA Times in some profile for me, Dick went backpacking in his Porsche. And I drove basically around the whole western United States, going from place to place. I had a ball. I mean, one of my favorite memories ever is driving up Route 5 one day. I'm living in the Beverly Hills Hotel. and I'm going up Route 5 to San Francisco, and I'm trying to see if I can make it in 5 hours from the front of the Beverly Hills Hotel to the front of the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, 5 hours flat, which you got to break a lot of laws. Anyway, I'm north of the Bakersfield cutoff, and I come up on a Volkswagen, a hardtop, and it's flying. But I pass it on the right, and I'm going pretty fast, and a second later, it's right next to me. And I can't see anybody in it. The car's like honking, and we're both going about 105, 110 miles an hour. It's daylight. And finally, this face leans forward like this and over, and it's Bill Russell. And in my day, he had been
Boston Celtics.
yeah,
Bill Russell.
and I had been the PA on the NBA, and he was really the only big NBA star at that stage who became my friend. And it's a friendship that continues to this day. He's the most wonderful guy in the world. And this isn't a stage in his life where people said, "Oh my God, Bill doesn't care for white people and everything." They couldn't have been more wrong. He didn't care for Boston at that point in his life, but he was the most wonderful guy in the world. And so we're racing like that. Finally, he says, so we pulled off and we went into a rest stop somewhere off the highway. And we kibitzed for about 15 minutes, and I found out he was driving this car back to, I can't remember whether it was Sacramento or Seattle, that he had made down in LA. He bought a Volkswagen and had them put a Porsche engine in. So he was actually racing my Porsche, his two Porsches side by side. But anyway, that was the kind of tomfoolery of those 9 months.
I'm sorry, I have to cut so I can change battery.
All right, so
You know, it's probably a good point here just to take a couple of minutes, because I have a very unique perspective on Brandon Tartikoff, and obviously I love him and have a regard for him that'll never go away. His sense of friendship, his sense of loyalty, I've already sort of commented on by when this incredible switch happened, when he went from being my guy to my boss, and how he treated all that and everything. I mean, you just get a sense of the uniqueness about him, his unselfishness, his caring, all that. But the thing that really makes him a transcendental, I don't know, figure in Hollywood, a figure of just amazing magnitude, probably the most famous and deservingly famous TV figure, certainly on the entertainment side, behind the camera over the last 25 years. It really comes as much, if not more, from his human qualities than his immense talent. And the reason for that is that, as you mentioned to me when we were just talking, he had this incredible way of knowing the most important thing for him to do was create an environment. But what did that mean exactly? Because he was the guy who was charged with dealing with the creative community of Hollywood and finding a way to get them to create great television product. And I think the way he did it more than any other way, Dan, was that he was the only person, when I think about it, who actually loved the process. The developmental process in television is, aside from being inhumane, it's just plain stupid. It's bound and determined to always exist, even though 95% of what comes out of it is failure. And most people get so worn out by the failure and become jaded. On the network side, they ultimately run out of gas after a couple of years. They can't deal with, they buy 100 things and 95% of them come back and they don't even represent what you think you bought or whatever. On the creative side, you get worn out by the process. You don't understand why these people, many of whom who are on the network side, who are they to judge my work? So you begin to look for ways simply to keep recycling the same work that's been rejected in the past. It's just a process bound to go nowhere. The only person who ever had the patience for that process and always would come at it with a renewed sense of purpose was Brandon. And I'm convinced that so many people did the best work of their life for Brandon because they cared so much about him, because he cared so much about them. And when they did less than great work, he didn't spit on it, he wasn't disdainful of it. He just said, either gave him great notes or he said, we'll do better next time. And usually, unless he felt he'd really been deceived, they would always get a second chance. And the number of people who just wanted to do something for Brandon Tartikoff were legion. And when you think of it, the run that NBC had, he went into that job as the head of programming, I want to say, in January of 80. And as late as 83, NBC was still last. In fact, I remember he came to host Saturday Night Live, which was a thing that Lily and I cooked up together. Lily's his wife, for those of you who don't know. Brandon in the early 80s had his second bout with cancer in his life, and it was a pretty bad bout. And he would get his chemo every Friday, and he did it on Friday so that by the end of the weekend he could be back at work on Monday. He went to the wig store, had the silliest wig and false eyebrows you've ever seen, but he didn't want anybody to take sympathy on him, like we wouldn't know from the wig and all that. And the only people in his life who knew about it were his parents and Lily and me. I mean, that for sure knew that he was going through this whole process. But everybody kind of did, and they just were blown away by it. But during that period of time is when the turnaround of this company started. And it was the first time NBC was ever actually number one. And that would run from about, I don't know, sometime in late 83 or early 84. And that essentially lasted until, with the exception of 2 years where I think CBS just happened to have Winter Olympics or stuff like that, that basically lasted the whole time Brandon was there, which was till the middle of 91. And some of the stuff outlived him and carried NBC really up until the early 2000 period through his friend Don Ohlmeyer, among other people. But so much of it came out of the fact, as you say, that he created an unbelievable environment for people in which to work. But the thing that really demands to be said, and I'm going to repeat myself, he's the only person I ever met who loved the process. And so when others would come to me through the years, and I remember in 92, after the success of the Olympics in Barcelona, the folks who run this company wanted me to take over. Brandon had been gone a year. They wanted me to take over the entertainment division, the sports division, the news division, have them all report to me. And my wife was scared to death that I was going to do all that and disrupt our family and everything like that. And I said, because it would have meant half a month on the West Coast, half in the East. And I said, I'll never do that because I have the advantage of having watched my best friend do just the entertainment job. And I know now it's too hard and too frustrating for my personality. I never have the patience for the process or the love for the process that he had. So I don't put anybody on the pedestal in the Hollywood community that I put him on.
So, and this might actually be a great segue. What role did Brandon play in bringing you back? You've sort of touched on some of this in your return to Saturday Night Live after the Gene Domanian years.
Well, he played the only role in it because there was no way, considering the way my relationship had ended with NBC and Fred Silverman, there was no way I was going to come back here. Brandon was the only figure at NBC who was a management person that I had a relationship with at that point. He was my best friend. I mean, at those years, if he was on the West Coast, he lived with Lily in my house in Mandeville Canyon and Brentwood every weekend. We all hung out together and everything like that. But that never changed one iota. And he gradually, I think, as that other thing faded away, he saw that as an opportunity to get me back into the company because he thought not only was I his friend, more importantly, he figured I could perform. And I know that he really felt that way. He's also the only person in those years ever lit me up. I think there was one time in 83 where he thought the show was starting to get a little sloppy and he lit me up. But that was the only time in our whole relationship. Everybody lit me up by yelling and screaming. He just said, hey, you're really letting me down, you're letting everybody else down. And I said, well, listen, from lack of work, he said, well, then you better figure out how to make the work product better or something like that. And I did. But he played that role twice in my life because I basically from 85 when I did my last Saturday Night Live, I did my 3 series right away. I did the first Saturday night's main event within 3 weeks of my last Saturday Night Live on Mother's Day weekend in May. And the thing that always blew my mind, all those Saturday night's main events that I did from the spring of 85 till I did my last one that aired just about the time I took the sports job in April of 89, they were all the highest rated shows in late night. They were now then higher rated than The Tonight Show or Saturday Night Live.
Wow.
Which in some ways was frustrating. I mean, I really love Vince McMahon. He was a great business partner and he's still a great friend. I mean, a really great business partner. We never had a lawyer or a piece of paper between us, and I never dealt with anybody who was that honest. I mean, quite a guy. But those were easy for me to do. I mean, that was 2 days' work, maybe 3 with editing. Saturday Night Live was the hardest thing that I ever did in my life. You start with a blank piece of paper every Monday when you're actually running the show.
Mm.
And it's not pretty. I mean, I remember one show that we worked really hard to get a Beatle, Ringo, to host. Oh, it had to have been the December of '84 because Billy, everybody were there, and the read-through.
I remember the opening piece with Ringo and Billy as Sammy Davis Jr.
Oh man, but the read-through was a disaster, Dan. Maybe the worst read-through I ever saw. There wasn't anything, and so I had to walk. And this is part of what you do as a host. I had to walk Ringo back to the hotel, which was over on 51st between 52nd between Madison and Fifth, Madison and Fifth, Berkshire. And luckily, a security guy here knew how to go almost the whole way underground. I mean, you can always anybody can walk from here underground to Fifth Avenue, but he knew enough to open doors and stuff like that underground, so that Ringo wouldn't be inundated. And we walked back there, and he was walking. He had his wife Barbara Bach with him, and I explained to him on the way, "Oh, this happens a lot, but you won't believe the script we'll have for you tomorrow." And I went back, and it's the only time I ever said it. I said, "Guys, this is too big a deal. This is the time you all write to your key characters," because we always would kind of harbor key characters and not try to use them more than 5 or 6 times a year. And some people thought I used them too much at that point, but Billy wrote a Fernando, Marty wrote a Ned Grimley. I forget all the other stuff that was written. He came back, and the show was pretty damn successful. It was the only show I ever was involved with where the entire show was not created until after read-through. And basically by writing to characters that were already established.
But I remember it as a great show.
The sets all pre-existed because Grimley had his room and Fernando had his flat and his little. So anyway, Saturday Night Live was hard.
Well,
there was if a show was great on Saturday, it didn't mean a damn thing on Monday when you walked in.
I don't know how long this process will take, but you've touched on a lot of the elements of this, but talk about the lumber that was there present from the Gene Domanian years, what you were able to salvage, and how you took that incarnation of the show. And
let me talk about the highs of that. Number one, the single biggest thing that became evident to me, the only big creative thing that became evident to me sitting in that little room in this building watching those rehearsals, was that there was a young non-cast member who was a featured player, but not a cast member. His name was Eddie Murphy. I think he was 18 years old. And he was just wildly talented. So I just clicked him off in my head. I'll do a lot with this guy. And what I didn't know for sure, but I would find out right away, there were 2 writers, Barry Blaustein and David Sheffield, who were a writing team. And they were really, really talented. And they wrote a lot of stuff at that point for either Eddie or Joe Piscopo. And Joe was good. Eddie had all the appearances of being great, but that's basically between then and when I finally relaunched the show, because there was only one show when I came back in April of '81, which I'll tell that story in a minute. The show, but so I knew that those people were kind of there right away. In terms of one other really, really key personality, Lawrence said, "You got to hire Michael back to be a head writer," and that ended up to be very painful and very short-lived. O'Donoghue and I coexisted from April until about December, and then I had to let him go because he just was so nihilistic in his stuff. He was so talented, but he also always would reach a point where he wanted to trash everything. So his idea was that we were on a death ship, I think was the line he gave to the press, and it was his job to give a proper Nike burial to Saturday Night Live, or Viking burial, not Nike, Viking burial to Saturday Night Live. So that was kind of the undercurrent. At the same time, he had great talent. There was that kind of destructiveness, and I won't go any further than that because Michael did do an awful lot of great work for Saturday Night Live. It just wasn't at that juncture. And but he asked me if I would hire a guy who would work with him on his radio albums and stuff like that, who I didn't know, named Bob Tischler. And I did hire Bob, mostly because I liked him in the interview, and second of all, because Michael wanted it, and that was one person I was more than willing to indulge Michael in. Well, thank God I did, because Bob Tischler became the sort of creative producer to the extent he would work with the writers through the night and everything while I worked on organizing the show and keeping everything spirits up and working with the host and the music and everything else, and the network and censors and all that stuff. He did a splendid job and worked really closely with Blastine and Sheffield. And almost every great thing that came out of Eddie for the next 2.5 years came out of their typewriters. Oftentimes, though, in fairness to Eddie, because Eddie literally could totally conceive a sketch. So if he could type fast, he could give you the whole thing and you could move on to something else. He was so fertile. And that's basically what came out of that period at the beginning. Now I start to add people later on to the show. Mary Gross, Robin Duke, Tim Kazurinsky, who did in that very first show we did in April. I hired him at the beginning of the first week that I went out to Chicago. I hired him out of Second City to come do the show, and he did a sketch that had a hell of a lot to do with that one show we did on April 11th, 1981, after being off the air for 5 weeks. He did a sketch that he conceived called I Married a Monkey, and he did the whole sketch with a live monkey. Do you remember that sketch?
I do.
And we did it once or twice afterwards, and it worked okay, but the first time it was unbelievable because it was as if the monkey was a human being. I mean, he would go, "Oh, the monkey's name was Madge. Oh, Madge, I love you so," and the monkey would go, like that. And there was all by chance. The monkey was not that well trained, as became visible in a there
was a sense there was a lot of improvisation there. They
Oh,
had to work
because
off
he had to
of.
save stuff. Oh, totally. You couldn't be more right. And that had a lot to do with it. But what really happened on that night was, and I had to produce a lot of tricks, and I got a lot of favors. Chevy had dropped by to wish us luck, and I got him to agree that on that night he would do the cold opening. And so the show begins, and you see an area under the bleachers near the door where the light had clicked out when Lorne had done his last show, because the last thing you saw of the very last show that Lorne produced in May of '80 was, I can't remember what the sign says, applause or live show or something like that.
Or on air.
On air,
Yeah.
and it gone dark.
Yeah.
So it's kind of near there on the flip side of it. And there's a trash can. You kind of hear noise coming out of the trash can. And the door opens up, and out comes Chevy by this trash can. The place goes nuts. And the audience goes nuts. And he reaches down in the trash, and he elevates up Mr. Bill and puts Mr. Bill on the edge of the trash can, I think. And Mr. Bill has a dialogue with him about how bad life has been since the original group left, and how much pain there's been for him, and all of this stuff. And it really goes over well. Opening titles. I think we went right into a sketch, I don't remember. But there's a series of sketches, including I Married a Monkey, that go over really bad. Eddie doing Cosby, selling Jell-O. I mean, all very funny stuff. And Chevy does the news. Well, this entire show is done against the backdrop of the fact that the Writers Guild goes on strike while we're on the air at midnight. So we've had to make it so all the material is clearly been sealed, sent to the Guild to prove that it exists before midnight and all that. And by the time the show's over, there are pickets in the street, and the strike lasts for a couple of months. So we never do another show, because I can't do a show without a writing staff. And it was probably a blessing. The show got glorious reviews, and the ratings bounced back, I don't know, 15 or 20% that night. And there was more than enough there, so NBC, off only one show, had to pick it up. So, just out of pure fantasy, that guaranteed me my first series commitment, which a year later would go on the air as Friday Night Videos, because that went on the air in '83. And so now we come back to start the '82 season, and the very first show is supposed to be hosted by Jimmy Kahn, and about 8 or 9 days before the show, he pulls out his sister's very, very sick. So I do the second show without a host, but the musical guest is supposed to be Rod Stewart, and Tina Turner happens to be in New York, and our booker gets the idea of putting the two of them together, which then ultimately led to a lot of recording between the two of them. But anyway, they did hot links on the show, and most people, that was the first time they did it together, and that left quite a impression. And Eddie had some pretty good stuff in that show. In fact, he got a glorious story written about him in the New York Times the following Monday, 2 days later, because the show opened up with Eddie doing Little Richard Simmons' Hot Tub.
Oh no, it was the James Brown Hot Tub.
James Brown Hot Tub.
Yeah.
No, then I'm wrong. James Brown Hot Tub is years later. This is the
Little
this
Richard
is Little
Simmons.
Richard Simmons' show.
Oh, okay.
And
Yes.
so it's a combination of Little Richard and Richard Simmons that
Right,
Eddie
right.
has created this character. And it just, I mean, the guy at the Times went absolutely nuts. He said, you know, this is the seminal performer in Saturday Night Live, and da 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 da. And that helped a lot. And I would say that that season, in terms of the shows, was largely kept alive by Eddie's light. In fact, I would try to find as many ways, Dan, to put pieces with Eddie in them in the first half hour of the show to bridge us from the start of the show. So he would do a lot of in-ones, whether it was his Velvet Jones, who had the book I Want to Be a Hoe, stuff as Cosby, Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. I mean, all those things would populate the first half hour, which was really at the time when you wanted to make a rating, would get us to update.
Gumby.
Yeah, Gumby, and it would get us to update. But if there are two things that matter to me about when I went back to the show, that matter more to me than anything else, there are two things. The next week, the first time I get a host as the producer of the show, the host is a pretty well known, very well known television star who at that point had several hit television shows. Name of the Game had been her first series. She won an Emmy at 19 years of age as the best supporting actress in a drama. And then she had played Mrs. McMillan for 5 years, and McMillan and wife, Susan St. James. And she comes to New York, and I'd say, you know, I met her on a Sunday, and I was in love with her by a Monday, and we were living together in a hotel by Tuesday. And
She was that good on the show.
she did the show on Saturday. Show hadn't even aired yet. She did the show on Saturday, and we were married 6 weeks to the day later.
6 weeks.
As we
That
sit
is
here
a
today-
whirlwind romance.
As we sit here today, it's almost 28 years, and I inherited 2 kids when I married her. She'd been divorced for about 5 years, and we had 3 together. So my life, my personal life, totally revolved around the revival of the show, I always think. And then the other thing,
And you'd not met her before she was booked to host.
well, that's a great bone of contention. She says that she appeared on the show. She did, too, by the way. There's actually a picture, I think, in my office that proves it, that I had supervised in my last year at NBC, that I had bought from my friend Don Ohlmeyer, called Us Against the World, which was sort of a rip-off on Battle of the Network Stars. It was American stars versus foreign stars. And she was a last-minute replacement when Kate Jackson got sick or something like that. But Susan came to do that Saturday Night Live because after McMillan and Wife, she'd been doing movies and had some big, big hits like Love at First Bite and so forth. And she was out promoting a movie called Carbon Copy. That's how she came to do Saturday Night Live. And
With
Carbon
George
Copy-
Segal and
George
Denzel
Segal,
Washington.
and it was the movie debut of Denzel Washington. And Denzel is the young black man who comes back into George Segal's life as the surprise child he never knew he had, and he's now about college age. And this was over a short romance while George was in college. And so Susan comes to New York, and her agents had not told her that there'd been any change in Saturday Night Live. She wasn't a big TV watcher, so she kept looking around for Lorne and Danny and all these other people, and you know, she had to settle for me. I often wondered what would have happened if they had been there.
Think
then
she'd
the
be
other
married to
thing-
Lorne Michaels at this point?
No, because Lorne had gotten married exactly 4 weeks before to Susan. In fact, he got married 3 weeks before the first show of that season.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which has a lot of stories in it that I won't tell that way. But I think the other thing that really matters out of all those years, and I assume we're going to have another session someday and talk about those 4 years, but the most important thing that came out of that series, other than a family for me, a real family for me, was that I really do believe that the show did reestablish its roots, and has never ever been in danger again of going away. And so if somebody was to write on my tombstone, you know, whatever association I had with Saturday Night Live, the most important association that I'd like to have associated with me is that when it was almost dead, he revived it. And beyond that, I think what Lorne's done since he went back for the first show in the fall of '85 to today as we sit here, which makes that almost another, 25 years. That's all on him, and he's done a glorious job. But I would love at some future time to sit and talk to you about some of the things of those years. Obviously, a lot of stuff around Eddie, and a some of the great censorship battles we had, which were pretty extraordinary in those days, and mostly around crazy stuff that Eddie did get to finally do, but I had to really resort to tricks I hadn't before. This is called a cliffhanger. And then
or a teaser.
the last 20 years of sports, ranging from, I mean, I'm lucky enough that all of the major sports have at some point or other all aired on us in these last 20 years. Almost every Olympic Games in the last 20 years. So if I was going to sum up and give you something more than a teaser, let me tell you the story about how Muhammad Ali came to be involved in the Olympics in Atlanta. It's about 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas in 1995, and I asked the nice folks who were running the games, who were my partners in Atlanta, who they have in mind for lighting the cauldron. And they said, well, we kind of are pretty set on that. We have an idea. And I said, who would that be? And they said, well, we have a great fighter here in Atlanta named Evander Holyfield, who won a gold medal, and we thought that would be really appropriate. And I said, oh, guys, come on, please no. I mean, first of all, the first headline won't be that he won a gold medal. Sadly, he has 5 children by 5 different women, none of whom he was ever married to. I mean, for starters. And I said, I don't mean to cast aspersions, but we're talking about the single most important creative moment of any Olympics is what you do with the opening ceremony. And in this case, you have an opportunity of a lifetime if you take this person that I have in mind. And they said, who's that? And I said, well, his name is Muhammad Ali. And there was this sort of taken aback look. I said, we can't do that. He's a draft dodger. And that set off an odyssey that lasted over 5 months for me to educate them as to who Muhammad really was. And I get it now. I mean, I remember asking President Clinton about a month after the Olympics on the Vineyard how it ever came to pass that a whole group of people, there were 9 of them, the organizers of those games, 7 men and 2 women, who are really smart, caring people, how they would ever come to such a limited view of Ali. And he said, oh, Dick, it's really simple. If you grew up in the South in the 60s and even the early 70s, what you read in the newspaper was so pointed that, for example, I was a white basketball player at a high school near Atlanta at the same time that Clyde Frazier was a player for the Wall. Clyde Frazier was a player for the Knicks. You never read about him in the local paper. You only read about me because that's just the way they treated things. And if you were a black champion who did something wrong, that's all you would ever be known as. And in their mind, him not stepping forward for the draft was a negative. And the president had a pretty good fix on it because he'd grown up in Little Rock. But anyway, back to the story. So the first thing I did when I came back to New York was to reach out to a man named Walter Bingham, who was known as Howard Bingham, who's known as Walter's a writer. Howard Bingham, who's known as Ali's best friend, is the photographer who's been with Muhammad for more than 30 years, lives in LA, wonderful. And I said, Howard, can you find out if I can work it out that Muhammad would light the cauldron in Atlanta? Can he? Because by then his Parkinson's had become very pronounced. And will you check with Lonnie, his wife? He said, I'd be happy to, and he did. And he called me back within a week, and they said, oh yeah, it would be great for him to do it. It'll take a little effort on our part because he's going through a phase in his life where he's feeling very uncomfortable being out amongst people, because this was when it was first really pronounced. So I set myself in various meetings, and ultimately with the help of Don Hewitt, who was in charge of 60 Minutes, I called him up, and we were casual friends, and I just said, hey, will you give me all your stuff you have on Ali? And he just happened to have a piece that had just aired in early 96 that Ed Bradley had shot for 60 Minutes on Ali visiting Cuba.
I remember that.
So I took that stuff, and I took other stuff he had, and I took stuff I had, and I cut together a piece that laid out Ali and who he really was. And I finally gave it to Billy at the appropriate time when he had a limited surgery. Billy Payne was the head of those games in May. And he called me back after he'd seen the tape, or the DVD, I guess it was a tape, and he said how much he was impressed by it, and he thought, I think I probably would like him to light it, but he still said only probably. So I called a few people who were friends of his. They called him, he called me back, he said, okay, we're going to do it. But it was followed a day later by another call saying, well, how can he do it? How's he ever going to climb all the way up there? I said, well, we're ready for this. Don Misher you're a creative director, and I figured out a long time ago he wouldn't be able to climb up there, and we've developed this device as to how he lights one thing, and it'll be on a little rocket, and he'll go up and light the cauldron. So we get to the night. Ali has rehearsed it once. He has never really been taught that you can only, or they haven't been taught, you can only fill this thing up halfway with gas. If you fill it to the top, there's not enough air in it to get combustion, you have to mix in oxygen. So now he's trying to light this thing that's been loaded in the dark. It's totally loaded, and the reason it took so long for Ali to light, and he's burning the hairs on his arms and everything like that, holding that thing like that, trembling, it's because enough of the oil has to burn off so you get combustion. And when it went up, it went and what's always repeated, it always looks like it went like that, but the actual night that it went up, it went boom, boom, boom. And in my whole life, I never heard a hush come over a stadium the way it did when they first realized that it was him coming up over the rim of that stadium to light the cauldron. And I consider it, of all the things I've ever been involved in producing in my life, the absolute highlight. Because it really was a great surprise for the audience, and it really was great for him. It made him think that the public really loved him, and he got out amongst the public again. Did it fit?
Perfect.